of introducing Mr. Bill James, and he, I've dubbed, is the Wizard of Oz, or the Wizard of the World Energy Forum. He has helped us put together an amazing program, and I'm going to let him tell you how we're going to proceed.
All right. So Chris Martenson's going to give the presentation on the keynote, and I've known Chris for quite a while, and he was a CFO of the Fortune 500 company, Vice President, okay, and has incredibly deep understanding of where we are and the problems that we face in energy, and I'll let Chris go ahead and start his presentation.
Well, thank you for that, and it's a real pleasure to be here today with you. This is a little, excuse me one second. Let me know if that's too loud. All right, so it's an incredible pleasure to be here with you today, and I have a confession to make right off the bat. There are a lot of people here who have really deep expertise in sustainable energy. I'm not a sustainable energy expert. I'm not an economist, but I play one on the internet. I'm a very curious guy who came across a story that changed my life. And I'm going to give you a piece of that story today. And by change my life, I mean I changed where I work, what I do, my business, and I actually travel the world now telling a larger version of this story I'm going to tell to you today. And it's about this. We have an extraordinary challenge on our hands, an immense challenge, unlike anything that humans have ever faced before. This isn't a US story or a China story or an India story. This is a human story. And it works like this. You know, we've got all this happy talk out here about how we're just going to move seamlessly into this energy transition, alternative green future, right? So fossil fuels, all but finished, right? Or the solution to the climate crisis, it's easy. We just transition to this 100% renewable energy for all by 2050. Or this one, this is the end of the fossil fuel age as we know it, says report, right? So it's done. I love that. You can't fight the future, or my favorite. My favorite is fossil fuels are dead, the rest is just detail. This is what I see every day when I'm in the media, and it's absolutely not true, in the sense that it misleads us into thinking it's just details. We can all go on about our lives, and as long as some smart people are working on this, this is all going to work itself out. And here's why. What I do is I connect dots. I don't just look at things from one particular angle. Turn that one off. So let's look at where we are. This is a little orientation slide. This is United States, but the world consumption graph looks pretty much the same. These are all sources of energy, a source of energy being something like a fossil fuel or nuclear or hydro or renewables. And what we can see in this story right here is that fossil fuels, of course, as everybody in this room is clearly familiar with, are 80% of the mix. That little tiny yellow smear at the top, that's all combined solar and wind, up to the point in time when this graph is completed, around the end of 2014 or 15. So this is the challenge, replacing 80%, right? That's a pretty big number. And there's some realities that we're going to have to look at when we're thinking about that. The first is, if you heard about Tesla's gigafactory for lithium batteries, it's amazing. They're going to create batteries for 500,000 cars a year. It's truly an astonishing development. That one factory is going to consume 25% of all the world's mined lithium at present. That one factory. Reports, when you say how many factories we would need to really make a dent in fuel as a transportation fuel, as petroleum as a transportation fuel, you need 200 gigafactories. We don't have the lithium. So there are materials issues that quickly pop up. When people are writing articles, I wish they would go and talk to mining engineers who are familiar with the actual supply of lithium in the world before they say, hey, we just built a couple hundred gigafactories, no, we're done, right? There's some other realities, which is, this is a study, there are many that look like this, that say if we did want to replace the United States' current power generation with wind and solar, what are the realities? And the realities are you need millions of tons of steel, billions of tons of concrete, you need nearly $30 trillion to do this. It's extraordinary. We've never spent that kind of money on anything in this country, not even the Manhattan Project, not the Apollo Project. Take both of those, multiply them, and multiply by 10, and you get here. It's a very big program. So This is something that we have to take seriously. It's not going to happen probably through just simple market forces. This is what gets presented a lot. I get these emails from people all the time. They're like, Chris, come on. This is U.S. annual electricity consumption, which again, just a portion of our power consumption. And look at the resource base. This is easy. Technically, we've got more than we could ever need. What I'm here to talk about is that is technically true. Absolutely. No question about that. What's not being talked about are the economic realities, the resource issues, and even the manufacturing constraints of what it takes to scale up to do something like this. This will be one of the largest challenges humanity's ever faced. That's the story I'm going to tell today. So here's the truth. This is graphing world real economic output against energy use. And we have to do it on a worldwide basis. You've probably read reports that say the United States is energy decoupling, meaning we're using less and less energy to get more and more GDP. What's missing in that is the United States has exported the energy-intensive parts to China. So when we import a solar panel, we measure the GDP from that, but we forget how much energy it took to create that in China. So you have to look at world energy against world GDP. What do we see? We see this really remarkably beautifully tight, straight, flat line, linear, I mean. This tells us something very clear, which is that if we want economic growth, we need energy growth. And of course, this makes sense. Everybody got here today because of energy. We're all part of the economy. So this is something we have to keep in mind, is that economic growth does not happen without energy growth, period. So the renewable story isn't simply a matter of saying, well, we're going to replace 1 unit of fossil fuel with 1 unit of new renewable energy. We're going to do that, plus we're going to have to supply what we need in order to have economic growth. And when I say need, I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about this as a need in just a second. And it starts like this. We don't just need any sort of growth. We need exponential growth. Anybody in here a mathematician? No. So I'm not either. So nobody actually understands what this means, right? You put it up and they're like, oh, exponential growth, that's a hockey stick chart, right? Listen, nobody really understands what this means. Exponential functions defy us because we're humans. We don't understand them easily. It's like this. If I gave you 2 erasers, chalkboard erasers, and I said, I'm going to score you based on how well you can bring these together at an even pace, you'll do great. Let's run this experiment again, but now I've given you 2 heavy magnets. And you'll bring them together, you'll be good, and then even though your muscles technically could work this out, your brain, your nerves, your muscles can't wire the solution, and we'll do this every time. That's because they attract exponentially. So how do we understand exponential growth? Because it's critical to this story. I have a little thought experiment, and it goes like this. Imagine I have a magic eyedropper, and it's magic because I drop a drop of water out. And every minute, that water will then double. So I put a drop in your hand, and after 1 minute, you have 2 drops. After 2 minutes, you have 4 drops. After about 5 minutes, you can fill a thimble up. Okay? You have a sense of that growth? Here's the question. We're going to go to a stadium. We're going to do 2 things. We're going to make it watertight. Okay, so this is now a bowl. And I'm handcuffing you to the highest row of bleacher seats. So you're handcuffed. We start at 12 o'clock this afternoon. On the dot, you're handcuffed. At 12 o'clock, I walk down to the pitcher's mound, and I put a magic drop of water there on the pitcher's mound. Here's the question. How long do you have to escape from your handcuffs?
How often is it doubling?
Every minute.
22 minutes.
22 minutes is one guess.
12.
12.
15.
Okay. So the answer is, by 12:50, that park is 100% full. And if I've underestimated the volume of the park by 100%, you look at me, you're like, Chris, he's a terrible estimator, I can tell. You can think 12:51. Doubling functions get away from you quick. That wasn't the important question. This was the important question. At what time was this park still 97% empty space? And how many of you realize the seriousness of your predicament? At 12:45. This is still 97% empty space. So we went from 3% filled to 6 to 12 to 25 to 50. We're done. 5 minutes. So When we look at this chart of exponential growth, this was a real chart. This was a chart of human population growth. It took all of human history until 1960 to get to the first 3 billion people, and it only took 40 years to get to 7 billion. This is where we are in this story. And the red is projections. If we get out to the year 2050 with 9 billion people, I will have been alive, if I survived to 2050, I will have been alive when the world population is tripled. Tripled. It's an astonishing thing. And I'll tell you why that's astonishing in just a minute. We're surrounded by exponential charts. I'm just showing you here, this is oil production over time, but I could show you ones for species loss, woodland depletion, aquifer use, miles of road paved. They're all exponential. We're not surrounded by linear charts, which we can understand. We're surrounded by exponential functions. And the key thing, if you take one thing away about this, exponential growth speeds up at the end. That's all you need to know. The first 45 minutes, we can all fool around. The last 5 minutes really count, right? So they speed up at the end, and we're surrounded by them. Now, here's world energy use over time. This is a graph pulled from a book by Vaclav Smil out of Canada, professor up there. And there's a couple things to note, really important. These are decades, 1800s on through year 2010 or so. And all these different sources of fuels. This is biofuels. So 1800, the whole world was running on biofuels. 1810, still. Hey, look at this. Right around 1860, we started discovering this amazing new energy source called coal. And it's way better than wood and dung and peat. It's way better. So you'd think we'd switch immediately, right? No, the energy transition before coal went to half the mix was 50 years. Because it took 50 years to swap out the old with the new. And while we were doing that, we were using a better energy source to replace a worse energy source. And then oil got discovered. Fantastic, even better than coal. And here oil starts in the around 1900 to show up in the energy mix. And look how long it takes before oil's half the mix. 60 years. Energy transitions take decades. And that's if you're moving from a worse to a better energy source. Humanity has never moved down the curve, meaning we're moving from a more dense to a less concentrated energy source. That is fundamentally what the transition from oil to renewables is. From higher density to lower density. Not saying it can't be done, but it would be a mistake to think that won't be one of the most capital-intensive, costly, tricky navigations that we've ever made as a species. The other thing to take away from this chart is it's not linear. Everything everybody knows about how the economy is supposed to grow was formed during this part, and it looks flat. If you grew up on that part of the curve, you think it's flat horizon. But we are at a stage where everything we know about how our economy works, which is it's supposed to grow exponentially, is based on using exponentially more energy. And energy and economy are tightly linked. There's no escaping that. Again, fossil fuels are 80% of this mix. Just important to keep that in mind. So here's a number. I'm going to give you 3 numbers today to remember. 10. For every calorie of food eaten in the Western world, there are 10 calories of fossil fuels embedded in that 1 calorie. Up to 1930, that was exactly flipped. Every calorie a farmer expended in either muscle power, animal power, or even tractors would deliver 10 calories of food. Through all of human history to 1930, farming was a net energy producing activity for humans. It's now a net energy costing activity for humans. Now we have to talk about the economy really quickly because if you don't have a functioning economy, you can't do anything. What was possible in Greece 7 years ago is not possible today because their economy isn't functioning. When your economy falls apart, you can forget about building big, fancy new smart grids and having a high-tech economy's production line. So I talk about this piece a lot because it matters to me. And if somebody said, hey, explain why the Great Recession happened, I'll give you one chart in 2 minutes. It's this one. All money in this world is loaned into existence. What do we know about loans? Well, they have a principal component and they have rate of interest. Because we loan our money into existence, we have an exponential money system. There's a lot in this. I won't go into all the detail here. I've got some books, I got videos out that sort of explain all this. But here's what happened. Look here, if we start here with the debt levels in the United States, and this is a chart of total credit market debt, comes from the Federal Reserve. This is everything, state debt, federal debt, local, student loans, auto loans, you name it. Not liabilities, debt. We start here in 1970, and we ask the question, how long before that debt fully doubled? And the answer was, that was about 7 years. So if it went from, I'm just making numbers up, 2, it went to 4 units. But these are trillions. How long before it doubled again? Oh, that would be another 6 years. How long before it doubled again? Another 6 years. And so on. In the last 4 decades, we've had in this country 5 complete doublings of debt. And this is how the world works. That's what everybody in the Federal Reserve, in the federal government, in corporations know. This is how the world works. We just keep doubling debt. Well, we're standing at about 60 trillion today in total debt, which means that if we want the world to look like it has worked in the past, we need to take that to 120 trillion in debt in the next doubling. And then after that, 240 trillion. Sake of, just for scale, the total residential mortgage market in the United States is around $10 trillion. So when we're saying we're going to spend another 60 trillion in borrowing, what on what? But here's the key. You see that little wiggle over here at the end? That's what almost destroyed the world financial system. We were within hours in 2008 October of a full banking meltdown, both here and in Europe. It was extraordinary. And why did it break? Because we had a beautiful exponential growth in credit, and when the credit stopped growing because our shadow banking system broke itself apart on some really bad loans and some stupid ideas, it almost took this world system down. Our learning from this is that we have a system of finance that is either expanding or it's collapsing. And not just expanding, but expanding exponentially. The red line is actual data. The blue line is an idealized hypothetical mathematical exponential curve fit, and it's almost perfect. If it was perfect, it would have that R squared is a measure of how perfect it is. 1 would be perfect. 0.99, it's all but perfect. So we have an exponentially growing finance system. If we want the world to continue to work like we think it does, we better concern ourselves with how we're going to get and continue to grow our economy exponentially. But just take 2 slides back with me and remember, the economy grows because we have energy, not the other way around. You have to get that order correct. And of course, there's all these things. This is a headline from last week. The IMF says, hey, there's 152 trillion in debt worldwide. We've never seen higher levels. McKinsey thinks it's 220 trillion. Hey, who's quibbling? Neither of these amounts are really payable unless we have a lot of future growth. Okay? So then we wander over into energy, and of course the quantity of energy is really important. Here's a chart showing worldwide oil output, and we've all heard, wow, oil's expanded a little bit, but we're breaking this chart helps us see it if we break it into 3 things. One is crude and condensate. This is normal, what we call conventional crude. The yellow is Canadian syncrude, tar sands, and then the black is American light tight oil, shale oil. So when we look at this, what do we notice? Well, yes, oil has gone up, but if we look at this period here, look at this part under here in the blue. This has gone nowhere. It's dead flat. And if we look at this period from 2005 to 2013, because I've got other data for this, we say, wait a minute. That's dead flat. We have a flat amount of oil output in the world. How much did the world spend trying to keep that oil output flat? And the answer is that just look at this yellow part. This is upstream oil and gas investment. These are in hundreds of billions. So this is the $500 billion mark. The world spent, over those 9 years, from 2005 to 2013, $4.5 trillion to keep our oil output pretty much flat. It's going to go backwards in these next couple years because we haven't spent enough to keep our output flat. We're going to face an oil supply crunch in the future. There's no way to avoid it at this point because we have 2 years of delayed first investment decisions by major oil companies. When those FIDs are gone, it takes years to get them back online. OPEC just came out and said, oh, well, yeah, we've noticed that. We think we need 10 trillion. I think they're off by a factor of 2. It might be 20 trillion. Because we spent $0.5 trillion going nowhere, and they're saying to advance oil over the next 2 decades, we're going to need 10 trillion. It's too low. It's going to be a much higher number. So here's your second number I want you to remember, 22. Somebody who's 22 years old has been alive when half of all the oil ever burned in human history has been burned. Wait a minute, Chris, we've been burning oil since the 1800s. Yes, but we're burning 2 or 3% more of it every year. which means we're burning exponentially more of it every year, which means that in just the last 22 years, half of all the oil ever burned in human history has been burnt. So what happens in the next 22 years, in the next? But really, quality of the oil is the more important consideration. How much we get, yeah, it's relevant. It's the headlines. Nobody talks about this. This is not in the news. And this is the most important thing. There should be a whole government department, the Department of Energy, focused on this. The UN should be focused on this. And it works like this. We don't actually care how much oil costs. I don't care if it's $1 a barrel or $1 million a barrel. What matters is when we go out and we put energy into getting energy, we want to get surplus energy back. And this chart is showing us. It's answering a question which says, if we put energy in, how much do we get back? So imagine this. If we put 1 barrel of oil into finding 100 barrels of oil, we have a 100 to 1 return. And this chart starts at 50. It's saying we would put 2 barrels in, and we would get 50 back. And that's awesome. That's like a 98% return. It's nice, right? But watch what happens as we start to put more and more energy in to get energy out. And you'll notice the shape of this chart. It's not linear. It's one of these crazy convex exponential ones, holding upside down. So the red is the energy we use to get energy. The green is the surplus energy left to society, by which I mean the energy that's used to fund the economy. Once you're putting 1 barrel in to get 1 barrel back, you have a 0% return. There's nothing left for society to work on. All you have are a bunch of people in the energy business, excitedly, busily producing 1 barrel of oil and spending 1 to get it. So imagine we had 1 trillion barrels of oil in the center of the earth, but it would cost 2 trillion barrels to get it out. Would we do it? Nope. Wouldn't make any sense. It would be a losing proposition. And here's where the story gets interesting. When we first started discovering oil and really producing it heavy in the 1930s, they were easily 100 to 1 returns. Saudi Arabia's largest field, Ghawar, easily well over 100 to 1 energy return. But then we started finding stuff that were more in the 70s, like 25 to 1 return. Still very good. Look at all the green under here. It's almost the same amount as under 50 to 1. And then we started finding oil in the 1990s. It was returning 18 to 1, maybe 10 to 1. And today, we don't know, but maybe oil today is 5 to 1, 3 to 1, something like that. We're finding less and less oil. They're smaller, deeper, and harder to get to. And here's why. The Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, all they did was stick a straw into the ground straight, 1,100 feet. And that one well, there are wells that were drilled in the 50s that are still producing 3,000 to 4,000 barrels a day. 1 straw, 1,000 feet, it's awesome. When we go to the shale oil, you hear about in the Bakken play or whatnot, if anybody's flown over the country and you see those patchwork quilts, because we're drilling thousands of these wells. In the Bakken, we're drilling down 10,000 feet, turning the drill bit sideways and going 10,000 more feet. And then fracking 20 to 30 stages, sometimes hitting a deposit that's no thicker than the thickness of this room. And we develop a well that will churn out maybe 400 barrels of oil in its first month, and will be 85% depleted in just 3 years. So think of the energy return of investing the energy to drill down 1,000 feet for something that pumps out oil for 50 years or more, to something that fundamentally depletes in just 3 years after drilling 5 miles. There's a very different energy return from it. And then the tar sands, they call them oil sands in Canada. I think it sounds better. It's bitumen, and really we're pressure washing sand to get some junk off of it. And it's highly environmentally destructive, and it's extraordinarily difficult to get. But the energy return on it is not that good. And so here's what the world would look like if we suddenly had to live in a world of 3 to 1 energy returns. Hey, it's not that scary of a chart, but notice all the green that's missing. What was in that green? I don't know. Maybe it was dog washers and lawyers and other professions. But society gets more simplified. We can't fund all the activities we do without high net energy returns. It's a really important story. And if we tried to run the United States on corn-based ethanol, which has a 1.4 to 1 return, this is the world we try and live in. Nothing is possible in this world. Nothing that we care and hold dear. There's no high-tech future in that particular world. Corn-based ethanol is the worst energy-based decision ever made by a ruling body, I think. But there's still time. So the brutal truths as I come to them is simply this. This is fossil fuels. This is one study that I think makes sense. They've analyzed coal and oil and natural gas separately. They've looked at undiscovered. They've done their level best, and they've said, well, we think that energy is going to peak from fossil fuels somewhere in the 2030 time zone. The yellow line is the amount of energy we will need to keep our economy growing so that it doesn't implode. Which means, if we take these two things and put them together, we say that, well, somewhere by 2050, we're going to have to replace 100% of the peak output of fossil fuels by some other means. Woo! How much time are we going to have to do that? I don't know, about 25 years. We've never done this before. And remember, we're not moving from to a better energy source here. We're moving on to a more dilute energy source. If we're talking about wind, we're talking about solar. We've never done this before. And oh wait, then we'll have to do that all again one more time over the next 20 years. So something is not going to work in this story. Something is really not going to work. There are solutions that make sense out there. There are things we can be doing, but not until we have this story right. That's why I do what I do, telling this story. So to just impress this has never been done by humans before. If we don't do it, if we just take status quo and charge into this future thinking we'll just always have energy and this slips away from us, we will not get to an easy, orderly future. We'll get to a different one. But first we have to have the right story in mind, which says we have to take this seriously. So here's another number. Here's the last and final number of this presentation, 2.45. We have a full, detailed understanding. Spain has the largest utility-grade solar installation. Spain's an awesome solar environment. And people have been calculating what the energy return from solar should be, but they've been sitting at their desks. Two people, Charlie Hall and Professor Prieto, went over to Spain and measured the output from the solar arrays over there and measured all the inputs that went into building them and calculated a real-world example from the largest utility-grade solar installation. The energy return from energy invested from solar is 2.45. Remember where that is on the curve. I'm not saying solar doesn't have a role. It doesn't have a role in the mix, but it can't be the answer if this analysis is right. And maybe it's wrong, so let's study it. Let's prove them wrong. Let's find different ways. Almost nobody is studying this at this point in time. No major governmental body I'm aware of is putting any money into studying the most important issue of our time, which is we should be putting our efforts to high energy return on energy invested efforts. Some of the highest efforts would be insulating buildings properly. Massive return on that investment. But we're not doing it because we don't have the right story in mind. The wrong story is, we'll just figure something out. It's just details. I started with all the wrong stories at the beginning. The right story is, this is going to be hard, it's going to be complex, but it's doable, but we got to get serious about it. So there's just a few truths. I said I was going to do the brutal numbers. I'll call them truths as well. So the first one is, we, and by we I mean humans, we've never had to replace an entire fuel source in just 25 years. Never done it. So it's an open question as to whether we can do it. This is really important. The second one is that the world's financial systems risk collapse. Financial systems, they risk collapse if they're not expanding. How are we going to fund that expansion if expansion requires energy? The future I see, once we hit peak fossil fuels, lots of things are going to be competing for the energy from those fossil fuels. The military will be wanting it. The farmers are going to be wanting it. The transportation sector is going to be wanting it. Everybody's going to be wanting it. We'll have to triage. We won't be able to do everything. But one of the things we will absolutely not be able to do is keep our financial system growing exponentially. Won't happen. And net energy is everything in this story. Net energy. What do we get back from the energy? I don't, what's politically doable and makes sense, or what makes people feel awesome, or what gives us the most jobs? Those aren't the right questions. We should be asking every single decision should be passed through at least, sure, politically what's possible, economically what's possible, all of that. But one of the channels it should go through is what's the energy return on energy invested from this investment? Whether that's a national insulation program or whether it's pursuing one of the other technologies out there. So where's the hope in this? I have seen there's only one place I've seen so far, and this came out in June of last year, the director of China's national energy grid finally threw a bogey up that makes sense to me, and he said that the world needs to invest $50 trillion in an electricity grid that will pipe solar energy from desert regions and wind energy from Arctic regions all across the globe to where it's needed. It's going to cost $50 trillion. Hey, that's only a little over 2/3 of world economic output. 2/3 of the world does nothing for an entire year to work on this project. It'll be astonishing. But this is directionally correct. There are thorium reactors, which the United States invented in the 60s, which could be an extraordinary part of the solution. Only India and China are currently working on them. The United States invented them. We dropped the ball on that. But China and India are both proceeding with that. There's an incredible story there that also could work. There are things we can do, but not unless we have the right story. And I'm sorry if these sound like brutal truths or unpleasant realities, but in my mind, they're actually exciting. Because A, we get the story right, B, it means we can start to do the right things. This is still a fixable situation we're in. In 10 years, it's less fixable. In 20 years, it's unfixable. That's my view. I might be wrong. Love to be challenged on that. So these are your three numbers to take away from this. 10, 22, and 2.45. I hope you remembered all of that. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that stimulates some good conversation.
All right. What do you all think? Anyone have a comment, question? All right.
Two questions, one probably easier to answer the other. First one, the 2.45 return on energy, which I do think is a correct way of framing that situation, was indicated as a point figure. And solar, etc., most of these renewable, and almost every technological development has an equivalent of Moore's law. So I'd be interested in that 2.45. What does that look like in terms of its trajectory? Because it's increasing exponentially for the renewables if you look at a cost factor as driving it as a cost for a proxy of energy input. Second thing, made many predictions, some of which I think are really, really interesting, some obviously controversial. I'm curious about your history as a predictor. Where have you been wrong in the past and why? I want to judge your assessment as a predictor.
Well, the good news is I'm all over the internet, and I publish all of my predictions. Predicting is tricky, especially about the future, right? To badly paraphrase Yogi. So the 2.45 is the first real-world assessment I've seen. And when you're doing energy return on energy invested calculations, where you draw the boundaries are important. So by that I mean, what they did in this study, which was different, was they said, hey, it's not just the installing of things, but oh wait, the modules have to be cleaned. Well, how did the people who cleaned the modules get there? And what roads did they drive on? And wait, we actually needed security for this stuff. And hold on, there were taxes involved. And they went down the list and they started finding all the things that were actually relying on that, and came up with a larger framework for it, right? And so the cost can be
a proxy for that. That's my argument.
It can be, but there's too many. There's a couple moving variables in that are hard to assess, right? One is that when we have money at zero or even negative interest rates, the cost of things is very different than what it would be under a different, more normal interest rate environment. Right? So I would submit to you that if we wander over to economic and monetary policy for a minute, real-world markets would never in a million years ever come up with a negative interest rate. So we're in a fictitious sort of rate for money right now that I think has driven a lot in the shale industry. Like, for instance, there's $350 billion outstanding in the shale industry, which is just debt. Forget the equity side of the story. If they wanted to pay that off, they have to, with oil at about 50, doing the numbers in my head, they would have to, somewhere around the next 7 billion barrels of oil production is simply to pay off the existing debt. They don't get to do anything else and drill other wells and all of that. Given the reserves they have, that's pretty much all of it, right? So the cheap money in this case has masked the underlying reality, which was that from a larger standpoint, we don't know if this really made as much sense from an energy standpoint as the economics taught us. So there's a little fogginess in that, which is why I think if we take the money proxy, I agree, it's a great way to start, but the only way to answer this for sure is to measure the energy in and measure the energy out. And then the final point on this is that We don't have a single closed-loop example yet where we take all of the electricity from a solar or wind plant and we build a whole new solar or wind plant 100% with the output from that. There's still a lot of subsidies hidden in this whole story that could include things like component transportation from far-flung distances, strange polymers that are used in manufacturing things. So, typical wind tower, with, I forget what it is, but it's some huge number of, close to a ton of rare earth elements that come from China, and you've got the big blades, which are typically manufactured down in Brazil. You've got the Westinghouse components, some of which come from the US, and put them all together. And so there's really there's a lot of hidden fossil fuels in that current. So this is an important question to really answer. So
Blades are usually manufactured locally due to low value added, so they're usually locally. It's not Brazil. I will give a little caveat. My own background is working with one of the world's largest hedge funds, and I author a book on economic integration for Harvard University. So I quibble with your meaning the dollar components, proxy for cost. And I would really like to see if you get a data, a lack of it, on net energy return, because that's a curve and not a point figure. And that curve is a really interesting element. That's 0.45. So if you ever get that data, I'd love to see it.
it's really hard data to get because very few people are gathering it at this point. So Charlie Hall and Prieto are the only two researchers I know who are taking this not from a theoretical standpoint.
And one can argue in the absence of that data, one could use either the fixed cost of getting a megawatt or a megawatt proxy levelized cost of energy in the ground, which is declining as a cost per volt renewables. So, like I said, I would say it's a false argument. You should put up the 2.45 as the valid one, but you should also represent the other data that shows a slightly happier story with a trajectory that's as exponential as the negative one you presented.
It's possible, but we don't have good data for that yet. All I have are
You can use the dollar per watt or a levelized cost of energy for renewables, nuclear, everything. They'll all show a curve that's declining at an exponential rate. So you have Swanson's law for solar at 18 to 20% for every doubling of unit shift. Every single source of material or energy, etc., has a Moore's law equivalent per doubling of unit shift. And this, I studied this in Roadrunner for Columbia University. I'm happy to point to this.
love to see more of that.
Okay.
And the real point I wanted to get to is, remember the 29 trillion if you want to do all wind and solar? That same dollar figure if you want to do that nuclear is around 4 trillion. So I know the world's a little nuke scared at this point in time, but we don't have to build light boiling reactors in a Westinghouse 5 sort of a component anymore. There are lots of new types and styles out there, and the thorium reactor is actually hugely exciting because we have probably 10,000 years of energy in refined thorium parked in the desert in the southwest of the United States. It's a thing. Could be done, but first we'd have to decide it's important. So if you look at it on a cost basis, on energy return basis, nuclear has a really big part of the story. I'm worried it's not being discussed at this point for reasons that are not fully logical at this point in time.
By the way, I think you have a great message, and I really appreciate all the thought and work into it. I just tend to be a very critical person. I like
Great.
my data up there. And one last one, I would like, where have you been wrong? What have you thought that was wrong?
Oh, you know what I
I
have?
made a lot of predictions, so I'm curious about what have you learned. It's like my journey of discovery was hypothetics.
Yeah, you know what I got totally wrong? If 10 years ago you said, Chris, here's where we're going to be. The world central banks are going to have printed up the equivalent of around 40% of the world's GDP and stuffed it on their balance sheets, and we would have had 0 interest rates. I would say you're nuts. It's not possible. Totally, that one absolutely got that one dead wrong. I thought the world would have woken up to that reality by now. So this is a complex, so the real message I have, another part of the story, is these are complex systems. And here's what we know about complex systems. You can't predict them. So we have to be alert to the idea that we're going to be surprised. So like earthquakes, a fault is a complex system. We study them like crazy because we want to know. Nobody can predict what's going to happen when, but research has shown us that we can predict that if an earthquake that's supposed to release every 10 years, a fault supposed to release every 10 years, hasn't released for 20 years, the chance is higher that you're going to have an earthquake sooner and that it's going to be larger. But again, just chances. Might not happen. We don't know. So what I'm really cataloging here are fingers of instability, as they're called, in our system. And so when I look at the 2008 financial crisis, we say, well, how much sovereign debt was there? How many derivatives were there? How much concentrated, too big to fail kinds of institutions were there? All of these things. And we ask the question, have those gotten better? meaning the risk has been reduced or has the risk been increased? It's a mixed bag, but we've increased some risks extraordinarily in that story. Does that mean anything's necessarily going to happen? Absolutely not. So I'm 100% humble about the idea that I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow or in 10 years. But I am confident. It's kind of like the difference between predicting weather and climate. Weather, very hard to do a year out. Climate, much easier, in the sense that we can tell that these warming factors are going to continue to be warming, right? So in this story, if we're not alert to the idea that we run ourselves on surplus energy, we ought to be wondering about that very carefully, picking high net energy return projects, we may find ourselves disappointed in how that story turns out. How that all turns out? Listen, I'm very hopeful for the technology. Like, if we can do battery storage, like if I wanted one thing for my government to throw $1 trillion at instead of bankers, it would be battery storage. We've got some exciting things out there that are not based on chemistries. There's things based on dielectric constants, flow batteries, quinones. There's crazy good stuff. If we can solve that, this whole story changes in a heartbeat. Now, with battery chemistry where it is, it's still a hard story to tell.
I have one comment because I like to take that to the basic. So what you show this exponential increase of energy that is required to continue the development of society. But it's nice also to have an idea about what it means in terms of production. And I just want to just say a few words. Is that, for instance, if you take we need a 9 terawatt extra energy within 30 years, for instance. I like to say in simple terms, what does it mean 9 terawatt is 9,000 gigawatt. And one nuclear power plant is 1 gigawatt, so it's 9,000 power plant that we need in 30 years. Okay, and 30 years is about 11,000 days. So we need to have the production of one nuclear power plant reactor every day for 30 years. This is an example for nuclear. So every day we need to have a construction of a power plant somewhere in the world, for instance. In terms of solar cell, if we speak about efficiency of 20%, then every day we need to fabricate a solar cell that is 90 kilometers long and 100 meters wide every day. If we do that every day, then within 30 years we have this extra 9 terawatt, which means that we are still consuming the 15 terawatt in fossil energy, more or less. So this shows really the challenge in terms of production and the transition of energy, as you mentioned. 50 years, I think it will be even more than 50 years, because we don't see these kind of things happening at the moment. We don't see someone trying to fabricate 9 kilometers per day of solar cell. We don't see one nuclear power plant produced every day somewhere. So this is going to be very challenging.
Yeah, there's two things embedded in that. One is the scale issue, which is that even if we wanted to, like somebody just emailed me this thing last year and they said, oh look, this plant in LA is printing solar cells, and they can just print them now like an inkjet printer. And so you just scratch at the article and you find out it's a gallium indium arsenide deposition. How much gallium is there? Not enough. This plant could run to the end of all of your own gallium and basically power LA. So that's cool, but it's not the solution yet. And I get where people want to get to the solution, but what you're pointing at is the reality, the scale involved. Really says to me that I think one of the dreams we have to give up is that we're going to continue to consume the same amount of power per person. Can we do that without wearing hair shirts and going into medieval times? Yes. The United States consumes twice as much energy per capita as Europe. Europe's fine, I've been there, it's great, right? So we could clearly, a lot of the low-hanging fruit in this story is efficiency. It's just using it more efficiently, right? And that's going to be a really critical part of this story. But again, we have to put energy towards that. And a good friend of mine, he does large-scale HVAC for large buildings like this one. And he said, nobody will invest the money up front because the person who builds the building, the person who finances the building, the person who leases the building are all separate people. And even though 70% of the cost of this building over its lifespan will be the heating and cooling cost, nobody's putting that in up front, even though that would be the right thing to do for society, even financially over the long haul, but we have a short focus. So this is the point is there's lots we can do, and I think that instead of trying to build that top line and build one nuclear plant a day, let's figure out how to make that one every other day and how we can live on less. Just as well, just as fine, but we have to be rational about it. Yep, over here then.
One of the solutions on using One of the solution approaches on using geothermal ground source in large buildings like this one is in fact to use, in the U.S. there's the commercial CPACE, the CPACE program, which puts it as a tax lien instead of debt. And it's a tremendous return on investment. It's way better than solar. And overseas, ESCOs, they're just starting though to look at long-term geothermal. But if you do it over like a 20-year span, they have a return on investment of typically 8 years, 10 years, so you can get there. And when so much of our energy load is BTUs, not kilowatts,
Right.
that would make an enormous dent in the short run.
Right. I
So
agree.
I'm doing a talk on that, by the way, tomorrow.
I can't wait to hear that because I don't know a lot about geothermal, but I will tell you I have solar thermal on my house, and the sun heats stuff up great. Nothing sexy about solar thermal, right? Boxes and pipes. That's it.
Well,
But it has.
actually use the geothermal to cool your solar panels so they perform more efficiently.
Well, that would be solar photovoltaics. Yeah, that would be great. But the payback on this system is 8 years for me. I calculated it, right? Because I use oil. I have an oil hot water system in my house. So it's about an 8-year payback at current oil prices. 8 years, that's fantastic. But the system lasts 25 years, so an internal rate of return of well over 100%. So financially, it makes sense. If you like local jobs, that makes sense. Local manufacturing, because we can make these here. I can't find a single reason why they aren't here, but when I fly into any city, I always scan and I look down and say, how many boxes do I see on the roof? And the answer is almost none, or they're very hard to detect. Whereas you go to other countries, Israel mandated. Why not use solar thermal to heat water? Because otherwise you're going to heat water with a water heater, which is either gas, coal, or oil. So this is easy, low-hanging fruit. It makes monetary sense, financial sense, ecological sense. And this is why I do what I do. The only thing missing, the reason we don't do it is we have the wrong story running. It makes sense on every dimension, except we still don't do it, which means there's something wrong with the story, not the facts. Right? How the story's told.
I agree with that. A lot of the story is missing. Just one interesting fact, a little piece of good news is if you do look at the U.S. back to 1900, unit of GDP in a fixed unit per unit of exergy has actually been declining. I make that point because you articulated that that's a flawed thinking due to the China factor, etc. It's actually a trend that goes back to 1900. And so producing a unit of GDP, we can argue whether GDP is a good metric for development, is actually getting cheaper at an exponential rate from an energy basis. Again, happy to share that information with you, or so I look.
Well, great. I'd love to see that, but not on a worldwide basis. And second of all, I'm going to quibble with you because since late 1970s, we'll start at 1980, the United States has been running a financialized economy. That feeds into our GDP, so the earnings of Morgan Stanley count, right?
The data I have goes back to 1900, and the only peak when we lost efficiency in GDP production was World War II, when we marshaled a significant amount of resources due to the geopolitical skew and a debt bubble associated with it. And at that point, we got extremely efficient in producing units of GDP, which is primarily war materials. Otherwise, the trend goes back to 1900. Happy to show you the data.
I'd love to see it because I'll quibble because I think if you debt adjust that number, we get some interesting results out of that. Debt to me is future consumption taken today. It bullshit. You have to pay it back in the future. Things change.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for your research. It's a very good, very excellent. I really admire it. But what I want to ask you is that, is there any way African nation will benefit from this energy? Because they need more help in terms of energy, solar, everything in Africa. So what can you do to make sure that they got this information?
So in a lot of African countries, there's just a lack of primary energy production, which means there's a lack of economy. If you want economy, you've got to have energy production. Whether we can do it more efficiently over time is of course. But let's start here. I was just talking with somebody from Mozambique, and they've got a lot of resources, including potentials for hydro. They haven't had the capital, so they don't have the energy production, which means people don't have access to electricity, which means the nation stays poor. Right? to have economic activity, to improve people's lives, you have to have primary energy production. And to do that, it takes capital. Like somebody, it takes money to build a dam, it takes money to put in a power plant of any source. So yes, there's certain things that we can do we're finding that are more efficient, but still it's the primary issue is how do you get the capital to build the pieces? Because I have great faith that once you give people electricity, they'll do whatever they're going to do with it, and it's brilliant. It's going to be locally appropriate to whatever extent, and that's it. You need to get the energy there first. Africa doesn't lack for energy resources, though. There's plenty of oil, coal, natural gas, sunlight, and hydro. So there's plenty of primary energy sources there as well. So really, this story says, though, that now, that this would be a good time. Like now, I think that the next 20 years are critical. I think we either begin to make the critical investments that comport with this reality, or we don't. If we don't, things get harder. Not impossible, but just harder. So this would be a great time to, my talk is really about creating the urgency to say, yeah, maybe we should start like 20 years ago, but since we didn't, now would be a great time to get really serious about this. And if I was in many of the countries in Africa's shoes that I've talked with, it would be I would dedicate as much capital as I could to creating primary energy generation now, particularly that could use renewables where they make sense.
And there's going to be a number of discussions about how to do that as part of this. And other questions?
I don't want to be a bad guy. Just to let people know, I am actually part of the solution, and I'm talking to a large Asian country about 1 gigawatt of nanogrid distribution to 10 million people. So I'm actually trying to be part of the solution with distributed renewable energy, so not totally the bad banker guy, just a critical thinker.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Chris.
All right.
And I think we're going to take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk about what we're going to do for, let's see, framing the future and what we can do to structure this. And also we're going to talk, tomorrow I'm going to show you what we're doing in transportation and how we're deploying solar-powered mobility networks. And these deploy about 1 megawatt of solar per mile, and they cut the energy. So freight railroads in the U.S., the 140,000 miles of freight rail in the U.S., average 476 ton miles per gallon. So if we know we can move a ton at 400 miles per gallon, why are we moving a person at 18? So if we take and we apply railroad efficiency with packet switch computer networks, we're going to build a physical version of the internet. So Hyperloop is going to be the high-speed version of this. What we're working on at JPODS is the local Wi-Fi version, but we're going to build these little ultralight personal railroads that move people and cargo around the cities at railroad efficiency. And it is that conversion of cost of transportation into value that pays for the distribution of the solar. And then Chris's point about these fragile and long supply chains is, I think, going to be one of the most critical things that we have to address, because if you don't have, for loss of a nail, a shoe was lost. For loss of a shoe, a horse went lame, and that you can have the whole thing collapse. So after we take a short break, we'll come back and go over what we should do to frame things. Thanks.